The air felt heavier than usual in the dimly lit study of the protagonist, a scholar renowned for their modern reinterpretations of ancient texts and an influencer with a growing following captivated by their intellectual charisma. A weathered package, devoid of a return address, sat on their cluttered desk like an enigma demanding attention. Its parchment wrapping, tied with fraying twine, seemed out of place in an era of emails and instant messaging. With a flick of a blade, they sliced through the twine and unfolded the package to reveal a leather-bound manuscript. The cover bore no title, only the embossed image of a coiled serpent devouring its tail, a symbol they vaguely recognized from some forgotten reading. A faint scent of aged paper wafted into the room as they opened the first page. The inscription was brief but unsettling: "To the seeker of truths, each level reveals what you cannot escape. Let this be your guide and your reckoning." The signature was absent. As they flipped through the manuscript, it became clear, this was no ordinary text. It was a reinterpretation of Dante's Inferno, each level vividly described with modern allegories that felt uncannily personal. The protagonist chuckled nervously, brushing it off as an elaborate prank by a colleague. "Each level reveals a truth sure," they muttered, tossing the manuscript onto a pile of unread books. Yet, as they turned back to their work, an uneasy feeling prickled at the back of their mind. The following days were marked by peculiar coincidences. Their once flawless workflow was riddled with errors. A public debate they had confidently prepared for spiraled out of control, leaving their reputation bruised. And then came the dream, if it was a dream at all. They found themselves standing on the edge of a vast, shadowy chasm. The whispers of countless voices swirled around them, too faint to decipher but laced with a strange urgency. A figure cloaked in shadow extended a hand, offering the manuscript. Its cryptic words echoed in their ears: "Each level reveals a truth you can't escape." Awaking in a cold sweat, they couldn't ignore the weight of the manuscript any longer. It was no prank, it was a summons. As the cracks in their carefully curated life widened, the protagonist resolved to open the book again, unaware that it would unravel not just their life, but their very soul. The manuscript's pages seemed to come alive under the flicker of a desk lamp. The protagonist hesitated, their hand hovering over the fragile parchment. Something about the first level Limbo called to them, as though it held a mirror to their existence. Limbo, as described in the manuscript, was a realm of noble souls, neither damned nor saved, their torment subtle yet profound. These were the great minds, the innovators, and the visionaries, confined to an eternity of wistful longing. The text lingered on their silent regret and obsession with progress that cost them timeless truths and the warmth of human connection. The words struck a nerve. The protagonist's life had been a relentless climb, driven by a singular ambition to leave a mark on the world. Awards adorned their shelves, and their social media platforms brimmed with followers eager for every insight. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, the echoes of estranged voices haunted them: family members left behind, friendships worn thin, and love turned into a distant memory. Turning the page, they found a chilling detail, a description of Limbo's souls, their faces marred with faint but innumerable signs of what they had sacrificed. They could almost see themselves among them, burdened by choices that seemed righteous but left them isolated. As if on cue, the phone buzzed with a notification, a message from an old friend they hadn't spoken to in years. The name stirred an ache in their chest, but instead of responding, they silenced the phone and returned to the manuscript. Suddenly, a voice filled the room, not audible, but as though it whispered directly into their mind. It asked, "Why do you abandon timeless truths?" Startled, they looked around, heart pounding, but found only silence. The voice carried a weight they couldn't explain, and it lingered like a question they didn't want to face. The following day, they gave a lecture about the timeless relevance of ancient texts, their audience enthralled. Yet, the irony gnawed at them. How often had they dismissed the wisdom of those who came before, in favor of crafting their own narrative? The manuscript seemed to mock their every move. By the time they returned to it that evening, they noticed something unnerving, a small line of text in the margin that hadn't been there before. It read, "Progress at the cost of connection is not progress at all." It was as if the manuscript was speaking directly to their soul, drawing them further into its web of revelations. The manuscript's pages trembled beneath the protagonist's fingertips as they reached the third circle, lust. They had anticipated a simple allegory: passion, desire, fleeting pleasure, but what they found instead was a vortex, a whirlpool of emotions and regrets that mirrored their own chaotic relationships. In the manuscript, the souls of the lustful were trapped in an endless storm, their bodies locked in an eternal embrace, tossed about by winds that seemed to drive them deeper into the abyss. There was no respite, no release, just the desperate, ceaseless craving for what they could never have. It was punishment for the insatiable longing, a metaphor that had always seemed abstract to them. But now, it felt eerily close to home. As they read the description of the damned souls, those who had used passion as an escape from the pain of living, something stirred inside them. The protagonist had never been one to shy away from intimacy or pleasure. Their love life had been a series of fleeting encounters, distractions from the pressures of fame and success. Each relationship had been a game, a fleeting connection to stave off loneliness, but none had ever lasted. They remembered their most recent lover, Elena, a brilliant artist who had captivated them with her beauty and depth. Their affair had been intoxicating, a whirlwind of passion that consumed both of them, but in the end, it was nothing more than a diversion. They had left her behind as they had left so many others, only to find themselves more alone than before. The manuscript's words now felt like an indictment: the lustful are forever tossed by winds of desire, unable to find solid ground. The protagonist thought of Elena's last words to them, the quiet plea that had been lost in the noise of their own ambitions: "Why do you seek everything except what matters?" Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on them. The manuscript felt heavier now, as though it was feeding off their guilt. A photograph of Elena, one they had kept hidden in a drawer, slipped from a stack of papers, falling to the floor. They bent to pick it up, their fingers trembling as they stared at her smiling face, so full of life, so full of hope. The guilt cut deep. But it wasn't just Elena. The faces of past lovers, faces they had long forgotten, flashed in their mind's eye, each one a memory of a relationship built on fleeting desires and unspoken fears. Were they truly innocent in this, or had they used every person they had ever been with as a way to escape their own emptiness? The manuscript opened on its own to a page marked by a red ribbon, an annotation that had appeared only now: "Do not mistake lust for love. Love requires vulnerability. Lust, only consumption." A cold shiver ran through the protagonist as they read the words aloud. The room felt colder, the weight of the manuscript pressing against them as they stared into the flickering shadows cast by the lamplight. The whirlwind of desire that had once seemed so alluring now felt like a prison, a reminder of how they had traded deep, meaningful connections for fleeting distractions. Their thoughts were interrupted by a notification on their phone, a message from a familiar number. Elena's name flashed across the screen. But when they opened it, there were only 3 words: "I hope you're happy." The text hit them like a physical blow, the sting of regret and realization slicing through the last vestiges of their self-delusion. They had thought they were invincible, that their pursuits were justified, but now, in the storm of their own making, they realized they were no different from the souls in the manuscript, lost, forever chasing something they couldn't hold. The phone buzzed again, but they didn't look at it. Instead, they turned back to the manuscript. The page was already turning, as if the text was pulling them forward, deeper into the labyrinth of their own failures. The storm in the manuscript raged louder than ever as the protagonist turned to the fourth circle, gluttony. This was not the familiar image of overindulgence in food and drink they had expected that. No, this depiction was far more sinister. The damned souls in this circle weren't trapped in simple excess, they were drowned by a storm, an unrelenting downpour of filthy rain and ice-cold sleet, as if nature itself was punishing them for their insatiable greed. The manuscript's description was stark. Here the gluttons are punished not by their hunger for pleasure, but by a relentless storm, the winds of waste and consumption that swirl around them, choking them with their own excess. The protagonist shivered, feeling the weight of the words. The storm was a symbol, but it felt so much more real now. The text lingered on the gluttonous souls, former kings, traders, and industrialists who had used the world around them for their own gain without care for the consequences. Their gluttony wasn't limited to food, it was the indulgence of excess in all things, power, wealth, and the very resources of the earth. A sudden flash of memory jolted the protagonist from the manuscript's grip. They remembered their lavish lifestyle, the endless events, the designer clothes, the extravagant purchases. They had justified it all under the guise of success, of living life to its fullest. The parties they attended, the exotic vacations, the private jets, all had seemed like rewards for their hard work. But as they stared at the words before them, something felt profoundly wrong. Had their life been a continuous loop of indulgence, disguised as ambition, the legacy they sought to build, the persona they projected, it all seemed hollow in the light of this revelation. Their choices, their hunger for more, were a reflection of a system that celebrated excess without considering the cost. And the cost was becoming undeniable. The manuscript went on, detailing the backstory of a prominent figure, someone eerily familiar. The great merchant of the world's riches, who turned a blind eye to the collapse of forests and the pollution of rivers, whose trade agreements ravaged entire ecosystems for the sake of a fleeting profit. It felt too close. The protagonist's success, built on partnerships and sponsorships, had long been intertwined with industries that preyed on the earth. They recalled meetings with executives of companies whose environmental records were anything but pristine, corporations that denied the truth of climate change while funding campaigns to convince the public otherwise. A sudden, piercing thought gripped them. There was a dark deal made years ago, a choice they had long buried in the recesses of their mind. In exchange for a lucrative endorsement deal, they had agreed to downplay the environmental damage caused by a certain multinational corporation. They had been young, eager to rise, and the money had seemed too good to pass up. But now, the storm in the manuscript, the storm of gluttony, seemed to reflect the consequences of that very decision. Their eyes raced down the page. For those who consume without regard, nature itself will turn against them. The earth will recoil, and all the spoils will be taken from you. The words hit them like a physical blow. Guilt rushed in, flooding their chest with a heaviness they could no longer ignore. Every bit of plastic they discarded carelessly, every product made from exploited resources, every piece of clothing bought on impulse, it all felt suffocating. The flood in the manuscript mirrored the flood of consequences that had been building in the real world. The disaster that they had helped perpetuate, a devastating environmental collapse, with irreversible damage to ecosystems, was a product of their own gluttonous neglect. The guilt was unbearable, but it was only just beginning. The protagonist had spent years being numb to the world's environmental crises, distracting themselves with the next big event or the next trending hashtag. But now, with the manuscript's relentless storm thundering in their mind, they were forced to confront their role in it all. The gluttonous souls in hell, drenched and battered by their excesses, felt less like allegories and more like a mirror. Suddenly, a text message flashed on their phone, jolting them from their thoughts. It was from a former business partner in the ecotourism industry. "We need to talk. The deal has fallen through. The backlash is too big. The public's not buying it anymore." They stared at the message, realizing how the web of their choices was unraveling. The storm was not only within the manuscript. It was here, in the real world, sweeping in from every direction, threatening to drown them in the very consequences they had avoided for so long. The protagonist closed the manuscript, but its weight remained, pressing on their chest, pushing them to acknowledge the truth they had long ignored. The pages of the manuscript seemed to crackle with an ominous energy as the protagonist turned to the fifth circle, greed. The air around them thickened, and the familiar hum of the world outside their study seemed to fade into silence. This wasn't just another allegorical punishment, it was a prophecy, one that mirrored the path they had been treading, a path they had ignored for far too long. In the manuscript, the souls of the greedy were condemned to toil endlessly, pushing massive, gold-laden boulders up an endless hill, only to have them roll back down each time they neared the top. The constant cycle of effort and failure embodied the insatiable hunger that defined their lives, an endless pursuit of wealth and influence, but never satisfaction. The words hit with the subtlety of a hammer strike, greed blinds the soul to its own ruin. The pursuit of more will lead to nothing, and in the end, all that you have gained will be taken from you. The protagonist felt their stomach tighten. Greed had been their silent companion, lurking beneath every decision, fueling their climb to the top. Every business deal, every social media post, every endorsement, it had all been about building an empire, about claiming a space in the world. But now, looking at the page, they could see it more clearly than ever. Their drive for success had never been about creating value or leaving a lasting impact. It had been about accumulation. A desire to gather more, to hoard fame, wealth, and attention without ever stopping to ask why. The manuscript detailed the greedy soul's eternal frustration, and for the first time, the protagonist felt the full weight of the metaphor. Their pursuit had always been hollow, a never-ending chase for more followers, more influence, more material success. But each victory was temporary, fleeting. They had built their empire on a foundation of ambition, but without purpose. What had they truly achieved? A memory surfaced, an old conversation with a colleague, a fellow influencer. "It's not enough," they had said, sipping their drink in the dim light of a club, "you have to always be growing, always be on top. The moment you stop chasing, you're finished." The words had seemed true then, comforting even. But now, in the eerie stillness of their study, they felt suffocating. The next page of the manuscript was unsettlingly personal. It depicted a figure much like the protagonist, successful, yes, but consumed by an ever-deepening need to expand. A man who took every opportunity, but in doing so, sealed his own doom. His success was built on the suffering of others, his wealth built on the backs of the broken. The protagonist's mind raced. Had they been blind to the impact of their own ambition? Had their success really been achieved through hard work, or had it been through manipulation, exploitation, and taking advantage of those who were too trusting or too weak to stand up to the relentless tide of influence their brand built on carefully crafted images, partnerships, and endorsements had often skirted the edge of exploitation? They had preached authenticity, but how much of their life had been carefully curated for public consumption? How much had they sacrificed for the sake of image and wealth? A line from the manuscript flashed in their mind, chilling in its precision: greed's ultimate reward is loss. You may gain much, but you will lose everything. The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by the sharp ding of their phone. A notification from their financial advisor flashed across the screen: urgent, the accounts you've invested in have plummeted. We're seeing a massive drop. It's not looking good. The words stung, but they were only the latest in a series of setbacks. Investments had faltered. Brand partnerships had soured. The influencer bubble, the world they had built their identity upon, was beginning to burst. The weight of the manuscript's words pressed down on them like an iron bar, and for the first time, the truth was undeniable. The greed they had once justified as ambition was now unraveling everything they had worked for. The empire they had spent years constructing was crumbling, piece by piece. The phone buzzed again. Another notification, this time from a former partner: the deal's off. Your reputation's been hit too hard. We can't proceed. The protagonist felt their chest tighten, a knot of panic and regret forming deep within them. Everything they had accumulated was slipping through their fingers, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But in the midst of the chaos, the manuscript's final line on the page caught their eye: greed's legacy is destruction. Those who live by it will die by it. The finality of the words sent a shiver down their spine. What had they really gained? Their wealth, their followers, all of it had been built on the promise of more fame, more fortune, more recognition. But now, faced with the truth, they realized it had all been a lie. In the end, the pursuit of more had cost them everything they held dear. With a heavy heart, they turned the page, knowing the storm of consequences was only just beginning to gather force. The river Styx loomed ominously before the protagonist, its dark, swirling waters reflecting a world of anger and pain. The sixth circle, wrath, was not just a punishment of fire or ice, it was a mirror, a reflection of everything the protagonist had become, of the rage they had stoked for personal gain and the silent suffering they had ignored. As they read the manuscript's depiction of the damned souls, they saw themselves in a way they had never allowed themselves to before. The souls of the wrathful were trapped in a storm of anger, perpetually fighting and clawing at each other, as if trying to lash out at the world for the injustices they had suffered. It wasn't just a literal rage, it was the manifestation of deep-seated frustration, years of pent-up emotion that had nowhere to go but outward. The manuscript read: here, the souls who let their fury control them are forever trapped in an endless battle, their anger now as much a part of them as their skin, until it consumes them entirely. The words struck like a revelation. The protagonist had built their influence on the power of outrage-provoking reactions, stirring controversy, and riding the wave of viral anger. Every post, every argument, every well-timed opinion had been a calculated move to keep the conversation heated, to keep the spotlight on them. Outrage was currency in the digital age, and they had become a master of it. But what had they sacrificed in the process? What had been the cost of their success? The rage they had fanned for likes, for engagement, was now staring back at them in the form of these damned souls, forever trapped in a cycle of fury that offered no release, no peace. The manuscript's words haunted them: the rage you stir will consume you. It will spread like wildfire, devouring everything in its path, until there is nothing left but ashes. A sickening feeling crept up their spine. They had always justified their actions. Every viral post, every angry response, every debate, it was all part of the game. But the deeper they ventured into the manuscript, the more they saw the consequences of their actions, both online and in the real world. They had played the game of outrage for clicks, for followers, for influence, but how many lives had been caught in the crossfire? How many voices had been silenced by the storm of anger they had stirred? How many people had been hurt, manipulated, or reduced to tears because of the fire they had started, only to watch it rage out of control. The manuscript's description of the wrathful souls struck a chord. Their fury was once a weapon, a tool to fight the injustices they saw, but over time it consumed their hearts, turning their cause into a curse. They are left fighting an invisible enemy, forever stuck in a cycle of destruction. The protagonist's thoughts were interrupted by a notification on their phone. It was from a former collaborator, a journalist with whom they had once shared a platform, a voice in the online world. The message read, "I don't know how to say this, but after everything that's happened, I can't stand by you anymore. The things you've said, the way you've handled situations, it's not what we signed up for. It's gone too far." The message hit harder than any physical blow. The words they had used, the way they had ignited arguments and amplified outrage, they had always been tools to elevate their own status, but now the consequences were clear. The battle they had waged on the internet, the culture of us versus them they had fed into, had torn apart relationships and friendships that once seemed unbreakable. It was no longer just a game. The anger they had fueled had turned into a wildfire that left nothing but destruction in its wake. They felt a tightness in their chest as they read another notification, this one from a longtime follower. "You said we need to be angry, that everything is broken. But I've realized, I've been angry too long. It's like I've been screaming into the void, and nothing has changed. I can't keep doing this." The words pierced them. Their followers, their audience, their community, many of them were people they had promised to uplift, to give a voice to. But now they realized they had done just the opposite. They had stoked the flames of anger and outrage without offering solutions, without offering peace. All they had done was fuel a cycle of endless fury that never allowed for resolution. They had manipulated anger for growth, for attention, without ever considering the toll it took on those around them. The manuscript's message couldn't be clearer. In the end, the wrath you stir will consume you. It will consume all that you care about, all that you've built, until you are left alone, surrounded by a sea of anger that will never cease. The protagonist closed the manuscript, their hands trembling. The weight of the words was crushing. They had built their influence by playing into people's anger, by making them feel justified in their rage. But now, they saw the full extent of the damage. The wrath they had helped perpetuate wasn't just an abstract concept. It was real. It was tangible. And it had cost them everything. As the storm of rage continued to swirl in their mind, the protagonist was left to confront the haunting question: had their fame, their success, their influence, all been worth it in the end? What was the value of a life built on anger? The protagonist turned the page, heart pounding as the next chapter of their descent unfolded before them. Heresy. The punishment of the heretics was not one of physical torment, but of spiritual isolation, a reflection of the deep chasm between their beliefs and those of the world around them. The souls here were trapped in flaming tombs, a fiery prison for their unwillingness to conform, eternally burning with the consequences of their defiance. The protagonist felt a deep unease as they read the description of the heretics, those who dared to question the truths held by society, those who sought to forge their own path, are trapped here, isolated in their own beliefs. They are forever locked in their tombs, burning from within, but never able to escape the prison of their own making. For a long time, the protagonist had prided themselves on their independence, their willingness to speak out against the grain. They had built a reputation as a truth teller, a bold voice willing to challenge the status quo. But now, as they read the manuscript's portrayal of the heretics, the words seemed to cut deeper than they could have imagined. The protagonist had often been celebrated for their ability to provoke thought, to challenge conventional wisdom, but the manuscript's stark portrayal of the heretics made them realize something darker. Their defiance hadn't always been about truth. It had been about ego. It had been about positioning themselves as the voice of reason in a world they viewed as ignorant, a world they felt they had to save from itself. But in doing so, they had alienated everyone who didn't share their views, leaving them isolated in their own righteous beliefs. The manuscript spoke of how heresy often stemmed from pride, the belief that one person, or one idea, was superior to all others. The heretics had been too certain of their own rightness, too unwilling to listen, too quick to condemn those who didn't agree with them. Their certainty had become their prison, and now they were paying the price for it. As the protagonist read, they couldn't help but think of their own ideological battles, of the arguments they had started on social media, the sharp critiques they had lobbed at those who dared to disagree with them. Every post, every tweet, had been a declaration of their righteousness, a declaration that they alone held the truth. But the more they fought to prove themselves right, the more they pushed others away. Friends became enemies. Allies became adversaries. It hadn't been just the followers who had turned their backs on them, it was the people who had once been close, the colleagues who had shared their vision, the friends who had been their support network. They had all begun to distance themselves. One by one, relationships crumbled. And now, in the quiet of their study, the protagonist felt that emptiness acutely. The manuscript continued, "The heretics are alone, not because their ideas were wrong, but because their hearts became hard. They sought to be right at any cost, and in doing so, they lost the very connections they sought to protect." A sudden wave of guilt washed over the protagonist. Had they, too, become a prisoner of their own certainty? Had they alienated everyone around them in the pursuit of proving their point, in the pursuit of being seen as the one who had it all figured out? The realization hit like a blow to the chest. Their boldest stances had often been fueled by a desire to be noticed, to be recognized as someone with the answers, the wisdom. They had crafted their image as a revolutionary, someone unafraid to challenge outdated views and confront controversial issues. But in the process, they had become a heretic, not in the traditional sense of denying religious dogma, but in the sense of isolating themselves from the very community they had once been a part of. A message pinged on their phone, a text from an old friend they hadn't spoken to in months. The words were blunt: "You've changed. I can't keep up with who you've become. You've been so focused on being right, you've lost touch with everyone who mattered." The protagonist stared at the screen, the weight of the words sinking in. The friend wasn't wrong. They had become consumed by their own sense of superiority, by the belief that they had all the answers. But in their certainty, they had pushed away those who had once helped them find their way. The world had become a series of arguments, battles to be won. But now, in the quiet aftermath, the protagonist realized that what they had lost, what they were truly paying the price for, was connection. Genuine, human connection. A notification from their social media account appeared. A message from a follower: "I used to look up to you, but now it feels like you only care about pushing your own agenda. What happened to the person who cared about all of us?" The words stung with the sharpest kind of truth. They had gotten lost in their own ideological battles, too focused on proving their own righteousness to see the cracks forming around them. The people they had once inspired, the communities they had once built, were slipping through their fingers like sand. The manuscript offered no comfort. Heresy is a prison of the mind. The more you cling to your certainty, the further you are from the truth. The protagonist felt the weight of isolation settle heavily on their shoulders. They had been so certain of their own beliefs, so consumed by their desire to be right, that they had shut themselves off from everything else. They had been the heretic, and now, Like those souls in the flaming tombs, they were burning in their own self-created prison. But as the manuscript's fiery words echoed in their mind, a faint glimmer of truth began to shine through the darkness. In order to be free, you must let go of the need to be right. As the heat from the pages seemed to rise around them, the protagonist understood that the true cost of their defiance had been their soul's connection to others. They were lost, but perhaps there was a way back. The first step would be to let go of the pride, the certainty, and the isolation. But would they be able to do it, or would they remain trapped in their tomb, consumed by the very beliefs they had once held so tightly? The protagonist turned the page with a sense of dread creeping over them. The next circle was one they had long feared to face: fraud. The eighth circle of hell, known as the Malbolge, was a treacherous labyrinth of deceit, a place where the damned were punished for betraying trust and manipulating others for personal gain. The manuscript described it as a place where the sins of those who had built their lives on lies became manifest in the form of a web, an intricate, sprawling network of deceit that ensnared its victims. The protagonist felt an eerie chill as they read the manuscript's description. Here, the deceivers are trapped in a twisting, endless labyrinth. Their lies have created a maze that they can never escape. Each turn reveals a new lie. Each step takes them deeper into their own web of betrayal. They are surrounded by false promises, by broken trust, and by the knowledge that they are forever trapped in the lies they've told. The words struck a painful chord. The protagonist had built their career, no, their very identity, on the foundation of trust and influence. But now, with the manuscript's harsh light shining on their past, they began to see how much of that trust had been carefully constructed on a web of half-truths, omissions, and manipulation. The followers, the fans, the supporters, they had all been a means to an end, pawns in the protagonist's game of success. They had promised authenticity, transparency, and a vision of truth. But behind the scenes, they had been playing a different game entirely. They had crafted a persona, an image that was far more carefully curated than they had ever admitted, not just to others, but to themselves. The protagonist had lied about who they were, about what they stood for. They had manipulated situations, curated narratives, and exploited their followers' trust in order to climb higher, to garner more attention, more influence. They had told themselves it was all for the greater good, that they were spreading a message that mattered. But the deeper they delved into the manuscript, the more they realized that the message had been nothing more than a facade, a carefully constructed mask that hid the truth of their own insecurities, their own ambition. The manuscript continued, fraud is a labyrinth of self-deception. The more you lie to others, the more you lie to yourself. In the end, the labyrinth becomes a prison of your own making, and you are left wandering through it, forever lost, forever deceived. The protagonist's stomach churned. How many times had they manipulated situations to serve their own ends? How many posts had been distorted? How many messages had been twisted, all to create an image of success, of wisdom, of certainty? They had painted a picture of themselves as someone who had it all together, who was a thought leader, an influencer with all the answers. But the truth was much darker. The image they had presented to the world was a lie. A message appeared on their phone, a message that made their heart race with cold fear. It was from a former collaborator, someone they had worked closely with in the early days of their rise to prominence. The message read, "I've been holding this back for a long time, but I can't keep quiet any longer. I know what you did. The article we worked on together, you took credit for it when you didn't write a single word. I let it slide because I trusted you, but now I can't pretend it didn't happen. The way you twisted that story for your own gain, it's all coming back to haunt me now." The protagonist's hands trembled as they reread the message, the weight of guilt and shame pressing down on them. They had betrayed the trust of someone who had once been a close partner, someone who had helped them build their platform. And for what to appear more successful, more credible, to build an image that wasn't real, another message popped up on their phone, this one from an anonymous source. It read, "Your followers are waking up. They're starting to see the cracks in your story. They know about the times you plagiarized others, about the articles you passed off as your own, about the ways you manipulated data to make your points seem stronger than they were. You've built your empire on lies. It's all going to come crashing down." The wall seemed to close in on them. The labyrinth had already begun to collapse, and they were caught in its center, trapped by their own deception. The web they had spun was unraveling, and they couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. The manuscript continued to describe the labyrinth in chilling detail. The deceivers are surrounded by the very lies they've told, each step they take revealing another betrayal, another false promise. They are trapped in the maze of their own making, unable to see a way out, unable to break free from the consequences of their actions. The protagonists stared at their phone, their mind racing. They had built their entire career on the trust of others, on the belief that they were an authentic voice in a world of noise. But now, they realized that the authenticity they had claimed to offer had been a lie. Every story, every post, every tweet had been calculated, curated, and manipulated for maximum effect. And now, they were being exposed for it. The pain of self-recognition was sharp and unforgiving. The protagonist realized, with a sickening certainty, that their entire identity had been a construct. The person they had presented to the world was not who they truly were. They had become so caught up in the game of fame, of building influence, that they had lost sight of the truth. And now, the labyrinth of lies they had created was closing in on them, and there was no way out. The manuscript's final words echoed in their mind: the labyrinth of fraud is a prison of self-deception. The more you lie to others, the more you trap yourself. And in the end, there is no escape from the web you've woven, no escape from the consequences of your actions. The protagonist felt a deep, crushing despair. They had lied to everyone, including themselves, and now they were paying the price. The labyrinth had become their reality, and they were lost within it, a prisoner of their own deceit. Would they ever find a way out, or were they doomed to wander the maze forever? The protagonist's hands shook as they flipped the page, and there it was, the ninth circle, the deepest, most harrowing part of hell. Treachery. The souls here were frozen in ice, their bodies contorted in eternal torment, reflecting the coldest, most brutal form of betrayal of those who loved and trusted them. The manuscript described this final circle as the ultimate punishment, where the damned are frozen in a frozen lake, each one suspended in a world of isolation, unable to move or speak, as their most painful betrayals are immortalized in ice. In the frozen depths of the ninth circle, the souls of the treacherous are trapped. They are locked in a lake of ice, immobilized by the weight of their actions. They cannot speak. They cannot move. They can only feel the pain of the betrayals they have committed, for all eternity. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat as they read those words. Treachery wasn't just about betraying others, it was about betraying themselves. As the protagonist continued, the manuscript unveiled a disturbing truth: the ice wasn't just a metaphor for the coldness of their actions, it was a reflection of the chilling emptiness that they had carried within them all along. The protagonist had built their entire life around manipulation and deception, using others to climb higher, using their image as a shield against the growing emptiness inside. But what they had failed to see until now was the deepest betrayal of all, the betrayal of their own soul. For all their efforts to cultivate an identity, to create a life of power and influence, they had neglected to nurture the very core of who they were. They had sold themselves out for the sake of fame, for success, for the approval of others, all while ignoring the voice deep within them, the voice that once called them to something better. The worst treachery, the manuscript whispered, is the one you commit against yourself. The lies you tell to preserve your image, the truths you hide from others and from yourself. When you betray your own heart, you freeze your soul. The realization hit with brutal clarity. The protagonist had betrayed their own authenticity. They had allowed the world to shape them, to twist them into something they weren't. The very thing they had worked so hard to build, this carefully crafted persona, this image of success, had come at the cost of their soul. They had sacrificed their integrity, their truth, in order to fit into a world that valued appearance over substance, that rewarded conformity over individuality. The manuscript continued, the treacherous are trapped in the ice of their own making. They have frozen their own hearts, and in doing so, they have become incapable of feeling anything but the weight of their own betrayal. The protagonist's eyes darted to the window. The world outside seemed distant, cold, a stark contrast to the heat of their emotional turmoil. The concept of being frozen in place, unable to move, to feel, seemed almost too fitting. It wasn't just their relationships with others that had suffered from betrayal, it was their relationship with themselves. The longer they ignored their inner truth, the colder they had become. They thought of the countless times they had compromised their values, bending them to fit the image they wanted to project to the world. They thought of the people they had hurt in the process, the friends, the colleagues, the followers who had trusted them, who had believed in the persona they had carefully crafted. And yet, none of them had ever seen the truth, that behind the smiles, behind the perfectly curated posts, there had always been a person who was unsure, insecure, and constantly running from the very thing they had once been passionate about. The manuscript's words felt like ice in their veins. You have betrayed your own soul, and now you must face the consequences. You are frozen in your own lies, your own self-deception. You cannot move, you cannot escape. All that remains is the pain of your own treachery. The protagonist closed their eyes, fighting back tears as the weight of their actions pressed down on them. They had spent so long running from who they were, so long pretending to be someone else in order to survive, to succeed. But now, in the quiet, in the stark light of truth, they realized that all their accomplishments, all their fame, meant nothing if they were not true to themselves. In the end, they had betrayed the very essence of who they were. The manuscript's final lines came like a cold wind. Only when you confront the truth of your own treachery can you begin to thaw. But that will require you to face the person you have become, and to acknowledge the pain of the betrayals you have committed. The protagonist felt a chill run through them, a deep, paralyzing cold that seemed to come from within. The ice wasn't just external, it was in their heart. The frozen lake, the coldness of the souls trapped within it, was the perfect metaphor for the emptiness they had allowed to take root inside themselves. As the protagonists stared at the final words of the manuscript, they understood the full gravity of their journey. They had come to the deepest, most painful realization: it was not the world that had betrayed them, it was they who had betrayed themselves. And until they could face that truth, until they could let go of the frozen facade they had built, they would remain trapped in this prison of their own making. Would they choose to thaw, to confront their self-betrayal, and face the truth of who they had become, or would they remain trapped in the frozen silence of their own making, a prisoner of their lies forever? The final page of the manuscript was before them. The last words gleamed on the page like a burning brand: hell is a mirror. The path out begins with truth. The protagonist's heart pounded as they stared at the cryptic line, the culmination of their journey through Dante's Inferno. Each circle had laid bare the raw, unfiltered truth of their life. Each sin, each betrayal, each deception had been revealed. Now, standing at the precipice of the ninth circle's frozen depths, they were faced with the most agonizing choice yet. The path forward was not a simple one. There was no redemption without first confronting the truth. And truth had never been so painfully clear. They had built their empire, their identity, on lies. They had manipulated their followers, exploited their platform, and constructed a facade that the world had adored, but it was all built on sand. The hollow shell of success they had crafted had crumbled in the wake of self-realization. And now, that empty shell stared back at them in the mirror of the manuscript's final words. Hell is a mirror. The words echoed like a dirge in their mind. They saw themselves as they truly were, not as the confident, influential figure they had projected to the world, but as someone hollow, someone who had sacrificed authenticity in exchange for fleeting approval. Their soul, frozen in the ice of their own lies, lay exposed. But there was a catch. The manuscript's final line suggested a way out, a path to redemption. The path out begins with truth. But that path was not an easy one. Redemption required more than a change of heart. It demanded action, it demanded self-examination and, above all, it demanded a willingness to sacrifice the very image they had spent years constructing. The truth was not just about owning their mistakes, it was about tearing down the walls of deception and confronting the rubble of their former self. A notification pinged on their phone. It was a message from an anonymous source, someone who had been watching their journey unfold. You're not who you claim to be. You never were. The world is starting to see through the illusion, and they're waiting for you to take responsibility. The protagonists sat motionless, the weight of the message sinking into their bones. The world was waiting not for the performance, not for the curated content, not for the manufactured persona, but for the truth. The question hung in the air: would they have the courage to reveal who they truly were, to strip away the layers of pretense, to confront the mistakes of their past, and to make amends for the damage they had caused? As the realization settled in, the protagonist felt a stirring deep within, a flicker of something long buried beneath layers of vanity and fear. It was a spark of something real, something true. The truth that had been hidden in the chaos of their ambition, the truth that had been stifled by their own shame. And for the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to feel it. But could they act on it? Could they face the inevitable fallout that would come from admitting their mistakes, from exposing their true self to a world that had only known the polished version? Could they bear the weight of revealing the truth and watching the empire they had built unravel before their eyes? The manuscript had warned them, hell is a mirror. And now, staring at their reflection, they understood the depth of that statement. The truth was not something they could hide from any longer. The person they had been, the image they had projected, could no longer shield them from the consequences of their actions. But the truth also held the key to their redemption. They could not continue to live in the shadow of their lies, trapped in the torment of self-deception. With trembling hands, the protagonist opened their social media accounts for the first time in days, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on them. The world was watching, the followers, the critics, the people who had once admired them. Would they walk away from it all, or would they take the painful step of facing their past head-on? They began to type, their fingers shaking as the words flowed onto the screen. I have spent years crafting a persona, hiding behind an image of success and influence. I've lied to you, and I've lied to myself. I have betrayed your trust, and I have betrayed my own. My rise to fame was built on deception, and now I must face the truth of who I really am. I am sorry for the pain I've caused and for the lies I've told. I can no longer hide from the reality of what I have done. The message was a confession. A raw, unvarnished admission of guilt and shame. It was the truth, laid bare for the world to see. The protagonist hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard, before hitting send. There was no turning back now. They had crossed a line, stepped into the unknown, and made the choice to embrace the truth. The response came swiftly, some supportive, some condemning, but all were responses to the real person behind the facade. And in that moment, the protagonist realized something profound: this was not the end. It was not the destruction of everything they had worked for. It was the beginning of something new. A life rebuilt on authenticity, on self-truth, on the courage to stand in the light without the mask. The manuscript's final words echoed in their mind: the path out begins with truth. And for the first time, the protagonist felt the weight of their sins begin to lift. The ice around their heart began to crack, slowly at first, but with each small truth revealed, with each act of redemption, the thaw deepened. The torment of their sins was still present, but it no longer held them in its grip. They had chosen the path of redemption. Would it be easy? No. Would there be consequences? Certainly. But the path forward, though painful, held the promise of something far greater, the possibility of redemption, of healing, of rebuilding a life that was no longer defined by lies. The protagonists stood on the edge of the abyss, the weight of the journey still heavy on their shoulders, but now, there was a glimmer of hope. A hope that the truth, no matter how painful, could lead them to a future that was real, that was whole. And in that moment, they understood that the only true hell was living a life without authenticity, without truth. And the only true redemption was found in facing the hell within.